So welcome to the webinar. So today we are looking at technology being the key to unlocking safety signals quickly and efficiently. I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Rutt, who is the CEO and co-founder of MyMeds and Me, which is a company that uses technology to transform both the capture, the management, and the processing of adverse events, drug safety, and product complaint data. Dr. Rutt is a trained physician specializing in endocrinology and genetics. He has held senior roles at GlaxoSmithKline, spanning drug discovery and development, which was across APAC, Europe, and the US. And he was also head of safety at GSK, where he drove significant innovation and streamlining into the organization. So he has the perfect combination of the tech side as well as the industry side to really discuss how technology can impact this space. So welcome, Dr. Rutt.
Thanks, Dr. Andre. It's good to be with everyone here, and good to be able to share some thoughts with you and your colleagues, either today or as you know, or later on once we share the recording.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your views on it all. So today we're not really focusing on COVID. Just have to admit someone. So today we're not focusing on COVID, but what COVID has done is made an unprecedented speed with which the vaccines are now rolled out. And what this is doing is creating a potentially unprecedented level of adverse event reports as we're scaling rapidly. And so given the numbers of daily vaccinations globally are in the millions, this means that we could be really overwhelmed with adverse event reporting. So, Dr. Rutt, could you perhaps speak to some of the challenges that pharma are facing today in this space?
Sure. So if we look at the level of vaccination, we're talking millions of people being vaccinated every day. And then, even if we take a very conservative view of about 1 in 1,000 people report an adverse drug reaction, and please remember that is just about 1% of the people who are actually experiencing the adverse event. So if we take the data that certainly has been published by the major companies, Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, about 10% of the clinical trial populations experience severe adverse events. By that I mean events that had a major impact on their life. So that's 10%. We're seeing 0.1% in the real world. So we are seeing dramatic underreporting, which is expected, but still 1 in 1,000 people reporting means, through our systems, we're seeing close to 2,000 reports coming through some of the jurisdictions, some of the countries on a weekly basis. And if you take that, that's probably a doubling of the volumes that companies are just seeing for their entire portfolios. So the traditional ways of dealing with safety data is for people to either call in, email in. That requires a huge amount of manual processing. And think, let's just take the call center piece. Most companies run call centers for obvious reasons, because it's local language, enables people to connect. First part, waiting times are huge. Just try and work out how difficult it is in today's world, with all the vaccine manufacturers rolling out globally, for them to recruit enough trained people, whether they're not recruiting them themselves, they're recruiting them through agencies, through through various vendors. Are there enough people available to manage those? Well, clearly they're not. And companies are simply going eastwards. We're going through Eastern Europe, we're going through South Asia, then we're going to East Asia, then we're going out to the Philippines. There are just insufficient trained people. So the challenges are really, how do we then apply technology? How do we overlay technology to make these processes much better, much simpler? Because fundamentally, we want the data.
Yeah. So do you think that the way things are being done now is just simply we're way behind the curve when it comes to actually dealing with this?
We work with another number of technology companies, and I think all of us have, over the last year, tried to model what we believe will happen. And we did some modeling towards I would say, in the second half of 2020, to say, look, if we believe the following, these following numbers, we believe that there'll be a wave of challenges. I think there are some very, very, I would say, creative folks in pharma who have addressed this and grasped what's needed. I think a lot of organizations have simply said, nah, you know what, vaccines are pretty safe. People are just not going to report, why would they bother? It's frankly, we've seen this in the past, whether it's regular vaccinations, you typically get very low levels of reporting because actually you're looking at well people. What we said was very different. We said, look, the public interest in this and the amount of media speculation and hype is so huge that every time somebody experiences a safety issue, it makes headline news, whether it's the New York Times, the Daily Mail, the New England Journal of Medicine, it's there. And you can see that with AstraZeneca, you could see it early on with Pfizer and Moderna with the issues or the questions around hypersensitivity reactions, essentially allergic reactions, where there was counselling for people who had known severe allergies and used EpiPen, were advised against getting certain vaccines. You can see the whole thing about cerebral vein thrombosis now. It's difficult to unpick, and my view about it is the only way pharma can get ahead of the curve is get the and I would use a swear word, is get the data, because without the data, you're just pissing in the wind. I mean, it's just nothing. You can say, I have no evidence that this particular event is associated with vaccination. The point is, you have no evidence, which doesn't mean there's no evidence. Doesn't mean there's no causal association. It just means you haven't collected the data, and that doesn't imply anything. So the better everyone who's in a good position, whether from clinical trials or in the post-approval, says, actually, I want the data. And that speaks to your original question, which we've come back to, which is, accelerated approvals are a challenge now, not only in vaccination, but across the entire industry.
Interesting. And so why is it important to change that now? What are the biggest things that you think are cause for concern?
So those you and I are both physicians, and one thing I would say is there's something called public trust, and there's a contract we have across the industry with the public, which is we contract with them to provide them good, reliable medicines, and they in return pay us some money, and that contract is pretty clear. And for patients, doctors, healthcare providers to fund the treatments that pharma is putting out, there has to be trust. And the trust is around, have we done the trials in a robust, publicly, in a way that's publicly open to scrutiny? Have we made the data available for independent analysis? Have we collected enough data? If we've done an accelerated approval and we've got accelerated market authorization, like the emergency authorizations, do we then diligently go out to the market and collect data, whatever that data is, on efficacy, but mainly on safety, to be honest? That's the main thing that bites people, and made that available for public scrutiny. That's what's changed. And that's why we're seeing such high levels of safety reporting. That's why we're seeing everyone asking questions, what does it mean for me? And, as I think I said to you, Andre, before, is I don't really care whether George gets an adverse event or the drug doesn't work in George. What I do care about is whether that drug is going to work or that vaccine is going to work in me, and whether I'm likely to experience an adverse event or not. And, there's the whole interplay of genetics, environment, lifestyle, whatever you want to call it. That's what it's about. So it's a data game now, and without the data, we're just nowhere. And I think that's the fundamental difference that we're seeing right now. Is it's a shift. And if I'm in the, I can see my own families asking me the questions. What's it mean for me? Should I have this one or that one? Which medicine? And at the moment, sometimes it's hard to answer those because we just don't have the information.
Yeah. And of course, each person has different physiological factors that can interact with things differently.
That's right. So that's where I go to. So why? Why are certain people? Why do certain people experience adverse drug reactions and others don't? Well, clearly there must be some reason. So the fundamental reason is either they're genetically predisposed to have some reaction, whether that's an allergic reaction or other, or their lifestyle makes it more likely, or they're on other drugs that interact with that. So We can look at cerebral vein thrombosis. We can say, well, it looks like it's younger people. It looks like, maybe it's women, maybe it's people who've had, who are on the obese side. It may be people who are taking estrogens. Who knows? Such small numbers, difficult to tell. But there's, you begin to unpick who's at risk. And I think that's one of the things we put together in one of our papers is just because the benefit risk is positive at the time of market authorization, that doesn't mean it's positive across everybody. What it means is overall, there's a positive benefit risk equation across those, 10, 5, 40,000 people who were studied during the clinical trial programs. And actually, if you're in oncology, it's probably more like 500 versus the now I think we're up to close to 1 billion people have received COVID vaccines. Well, clearly the genetic diversity and the lifestyle diversity and the other medicines they're exposed to, or other, the environmental factors they're exposed to are radically different to what those 40,000 people saw in clinical trials.
Yeah. And so how are pharma companies able to get the data in an efficient way? What would you recommend in terms of ways that technology could address getting the data?
So if we start from the end game is analysis of essentially benefit and risk. So does the drug work? Does it work in certain people? Does the vaccine work? And does it have any risks? And if so, what are those risks and where are those risks? So to do that, you need data. And I think the first, from a physician point of view, I'd say, well, go to the source. That seems like a pretty logical place to go. Start with the patient and make it really easy for patients to collect that data, whether during clinical trials or post-approval. Make it really intuitive and easy for them, and make it obvious for them as to how they can provide that data in a digital format, in a dynamic, interactive, easy-to-use way. And I would say enable all the other actors in the process. So I'm not saying that we should overhaul the entire process overnight. I'm saying you've got nurses, doctors, whether in the regular marketed product world or as part of post-approval programs or support programs, or within whether they're working in call centers. All those actors can be equipped with digital tools to capture that data in a much more intuitive, much more direct way, and a much more standard way. Because ultimately, if you get data in 10 different formats, in 10 different ways of being, in different ways of coding, it's very difficult to analyze that data. And if you take clinical trials as the extreme example, people struggle a lot to try and standardize the way data is collected. And even then, I would say safety data is not collected in a particularly smart way. It's collected by sites as opposed to patients. But let's take that there's an attempt to standardize in the marketed product setting. There's little effort to standardize how that data is collected, and therefore you essentially end up with a garbage in, garbage out scenario that it's actually hard to analyze the data because there's so much diversity in how the data is collected. And where it's collected consistently, you can begin to make analyses. And obviously for the more serious or severe or hospital events, then usually it's more likely collected in a relatively medically meaningful way. But once you're outside the hospital setting, it's all bets are off. And I think that's the challenge. And that's why you see, 1 week, this is, a particular issue is highlighted in the media, and then it goes away, because actually once the data collection tools become improved, it gets solved. So I think, go to the source, standardize, create platforms, use platforms that are really intuitive and, mobile friendly, that are easy for patients and doctors and others to navigate, multi-language. It's pretty obvious. We all speak English. The whole world doesn't speak English. Make it available in local language. Make it available in ways that everyone can utilize and provide their data, and then make the data available in real time. Don't prevaricate. Don't put multiple intermediaries in the process, because all that does is stop or pause the ability to detect signals, which by that I mean potential safety issues at the earliest opportunity. You've got multiple human beings in the middle of all this, means that you're essentially creating barriers for the ultimate goal, which is meaningful analysis.
I remember last time we spoke, we were talking about conversational AI as a potential route. What would you recommend as a nice route that would be easier? I mean, I think standardization may be difficult, but what would you say is the best practice way that you would recommend to collect that data?
I mean, I'll probably give you a couple of answers. So some people will never want to use a digital tool and will find it difficult, and that may be because they have arthritis, their vision's impaired, they don't have the access to a smartphone or a computer, or they just simply prefer to talk to someone. And I think for those folks, and let's say that's 10% of the population in our current environment, we have to make available some form of interactive voice activities that people can go to. What I would say is those people who are operating in a voice world also have to be equipped with tools that guide them to collect the best data possible, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I've got to remember it's product 1 and I've got to ask these questions, or it's product 3 and I've got to ask the following questions. Make it easy for them to have a dynamic interface that enables them to collect the right data on the right product with, in terms of the events that are being surfaced. So that's the first thing. Similarly, I would then say for the other 90% of people, like we've seen across other industries, is make it really easy for them to provide the data live in a digital form, which is interactive. And whether that's chatbot, whether it's form-based, whether it's got a degree of AI components feeding that interface, it sort of doesn't matter, but it makes it much more likely that the reports will come through, but also they'll come through in a meaningful form with a meaningful data package.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, it would be good to have those multiple formats, but then they all go into the same database and get processed the same way.
Correct, and I think that's a great point. Is ultimately, to me, I always look at car manufacturing as a good example. VW makes an inordinate amount of cars, whether they're Volkswagen, Seats, or Skodas. They're actually, they look different. They're slightly different. They have a slightly different purpose. They operate for different markets. But underneath it, their platform and the technologies they use are very similar. So they have a certain number of standard platforms which they deploy across their global product line. And I think the same can go for technology that is delivered to pharma. Is what the patient, doctor, nurse, call center, operative, sales rep see, and how the interface they utilize, whether that's, as you say, a conversational interface, a chatbot interface, a dynamic form interface, doesn't really matter as long as the fundamental platform underneath it is the same. The data is coded and structured in the same way, and then ultimately is fed immediately to the database and for analysis in the same way. That's the goal. Underneath it, the platform should be universal, because then you've got the benefits of data security, speed, scalability, all of that, which, I mean, frankly, we were talking before the call started, this is where I would say pharma needs to step away from trying to home brew and home build, because the issues of security, scalability, performance may seem trivial initially, but once you scale your system up and once you make it global, they are huge challenges. And then maintaining those systems over a period of time is not an easy thing to do. It's better left to people who do that on a daily basis, as opposed to, let's all build our own electric car today. I mean, as I said to you earlier, the great thing about Tesla, it provides you updates on the Wi-Fi so that your car's always up to date. If you and I built a car, we could probably build it, but I bet we wouldn't be able to update it.
In fact, that reminds me of a very long time ago, but we did a project for a company in Japan, pharma company, and there were all these glitches in the interface, and we were trying to figure out why, because we tested it on all these different browsers, and it turned out that they were still using Internet Explorer 1.
Yeah, well, that's right.
And it was so, we were at, I don't know how far, but, and so... Yeah, so that's going to be a problem. How do you think the industry could come together to standardize globally? I mean, I almost laughed when I said it, I know.
Yeah, no, I've been involved in multiple benchmarking initiatives collaborative initiatives over a period of time. And there are some, excuse me, companies are trying and have tried in the past. And there was a collaboration on safety databases saying, let's create a cloud-based standard safety database. That fell apart because everyone decided that they needed slightly different data structures because of their portfolios. I think that there is an opportunity to make a global system, and I think one of the things in the twinkle of our eye, in the back of our minds, is that there is an opportunity to actually radically disrupt how the systems could run and create a much more standard platform globally. So I think pharma do want to collaborate and do want to work together. I think they make life difficult for themselves because although the regulations are the same for everyone, every single pharma company seems to find a different way of interpreting them. And having worked now with multiple companies, you go, well, the regulations say this, and they go, yeah, but they mean that. You go, really? Okay, well, so that's the slight challenge. And I suppose I look at just the simple thing of, I think J&J wanted to collaborate with the other vaccine manufacturers on thrombotic events, and they said, well, we don't want to do that. And there may be very good reasons for that. But I think the way I would view it at the moment is if companies can make it really easy for some of the interfaces to be different, but actually underneath the hood things work in a more standard way, and that can be deployed across companies, that's a good thing. And that's probably the best way forward. I think trying to get pharma to collaborate and create its own data standards, it's proved pretty painful in most areas. And the way where it's been successful is, if you take ICH or CEOMS, is where companies have almost they're groups that have taken the lead on this and trying to create a more standardized way of doing things, almost separate from the pharma companies themselves.
So what's the answer? How are we going to, how can we do this?
So I think the way is fairly straightforward. Is to me, if you look at the final step is the regulations. The regulations are not that different globally. They apply in a standard way to pharma. I think we focus on, well, make it, try and get a groundswell moving forward and say, okay, so here's a group of pharma that are beginning to standardize their use of technologies. We can see that already. They begin to showcase the benefits of technology applied to their environment, which is the benefit and the value that brings to how they manage their medicines, whether during clinical development or post-approval. Those case studies, and that begins to develop and begins to get other people on board. That's probably the easiest way of doing it, rather than trying to create consortia, because consortia are painful. Whereas the other way is more about leading by example and showcasing, well, here's a way that has worked. If you come on board, actually we can build on the initial success. Let's do more. And to be honest, that's what we've seen as an organization. We've seen exactly that. You show success, people come on board and say, well, actually, we could do a lot more with this. Let's now get our mates on board from another organization that creates a groundswell. That's a more productive way of doing it, rather than trying to force the issue.
And you've got experience in doing that with pharma in terms of the AE reporting. What is the difference, for example, I'm just thinking of one of your clients particularly, but for them, the one we mentioned earlier, what was the difference before doing that the old way versus changing it to the new way? What was the difference in terms of their processes, their speed, that kind of thing?
So the first, we did some benchmarking very early on. The first interesting thing, and this we're talking about a top 10 pharma here, so it's big numbers. The first part was interesting, and it mirrors my own experience of pharma. Is we asked the question, so the first question we were asked is how much better is the process following the deployment of your technology? And we went, well, what's the starting point? What was what's the time and motion? What are the metrics for your original process? And everyone went, well, I don't know.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. Or we said, how many minutes does it take to do the following task? So we started off with some basic first principles, and I think after the first 3 months, we saw just within. So if we take this was our first deployment was within a call center, and we looked at the call center operation, and that resulted within the first 3 months of 35% savings in call center time in terms of the actual time to get data in, do it in a standardized way, and then output it. So that's a pure play. Then there's downstream benefits in case processing, which we're saying it's around another 50% delivery of reduction in terms of digital files coming through. There's obviously then you've got language. So if you've got files coming in which can be auto-translated back from Japanese to English, that clearly saves time. So those are major benefits, and the whole area of subsequent reduction in follow-up and everything else delivers more benefit. And the final piece, which is quite interesting, every pharma company uses a variety of systems, and those systems have to reconcile across each other. So saying, did I really send you this data package? Did this package get received appropriately? Is it correctly notified between the different systems? And typically that's all done manually. So reconciliation tasks are done manually. We automate all that. And just a trivial example, it was 10 minutes saving per case. Now, if you're doing 2,000 cases a week, that's quite a lot of saving. You take that as a pure FTE play. And the final piece, I think this is probably where we've seen outside of the regular, call it, I've seen call center, I would say, is a lot of that is resources. If I take more specialist programs where we're dealing with REMS or risk management plans, patient support programs, and the post-approval programs, and this goes back to your original question around accelerated approvals. We've got complex products, immunotherapeutics, oncology products, where the richness and the quality of data is an imperative, where physicians are being trained to manage programs, where you've got specialist pharmacies administering intravenous products. Those trained users then are not only seeing resource savings because they can use their iPads, they can use mobiles, they can be on a full desktop, but importantly they're also being able to surface questions in a much more dynamic way than they would have done otherwise. And so they can be trained, they can have the questions, as opposed to what was I supposed to ask? Oh, damn, I forgot. Well, I better go back to the patient or the doctor again. So I think we're seeing a massive impact on quality in those areas where actually quality matters a lot, because you're really in a position to build the understanding of a new product or a newly launched product in that first, call it 1 to 5 year window. And those companies are then seeing this as a big opportunity to really to be much more competitive, and I would say much more focused on what the patient experiences are and how can they manage their product much more appropriately in terms of both the adherence to the product. So there's no point giving people a medicine if they then stop taking it. How do you manage adherence? So you collect the data, manage adherence, but also are able to really refine the type of data that is collected.
Interesting. I guess we've covered so many bits. I think I might open it up for questions then, because there might be some interesting questions from the floor. So does anyone have any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask if you've got a question. Salman?
Yeah, Andrew, thank you so much for your presentation. I was just thinking when you were presenting a couple of things, it's this time in the afternoon, at least in Switzerland, a couple of philosophical points, and the ones are questions. I wonder if in today's environment, if we are perhaps collecting too much data, and that is something that perhaps I think you probably will disagree with, but I think we can over-collect data, and then we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, no,
that is one thing.
Yeah, go for it. So let me answer that one first. So I think that's a great point. And if I take clinical trials, if we start on clinical trials, So when I was running trials, people would go, well, how many data points, if only we can collect these lab values and this particular parameter. In the end, you're left with, well, what am I going to do with that data? Is it going to change my decision making? So I think you're right. I think the other part I would say in the post-approval world at the moment, it's painful how little data we have on medicines in that first few years post-launch. So except once we're in 30 years post-market authorization, the product's being genericized, the main thing we want to know about is it manufactured correctly? I mean, frankly, that's the main issue. You've got generic manufacturers, all sorts of different sources, different strengths. You need to know, is it safe because is it manufactured right? Early on, I actually feel we don't get much data. I also feel, and this is where the COVID example is a good one, a company that can say, you know what, I've collected, I don't know, let's say 100,000 non-serious adverse events. And you know what I saw? I was very diligent about collecting them. It was painful. All we found was local reactions, some headaches, some mild fever. People got, a bit tired. Some people felt, more tired, had to go to bed for a day or so. But we saw no serious reactions. Actually, everyone would go, oh, give me that vaccine. That's great, because you've been really diligent, painstakingly collecting the data, and you saw very little. As opposed to the company says, you know what, we don't like non-serious adverse events. We think they're a pain in the neck, and frankly, local reactions are just irrelevant. Let's not bother collecting them. And then they see one or two serious events. People go, well, you've only got 1,000 events, and of those 1,000 events, you've got 2 or 3 serious reactions. We're worried. So I think there's a bit of an opportunity here to derail the social media and media messaging by saying, you know what, we've got every data point we can, and we're pretty certain that we're seeing a very positive benefit risk across our product.
So, Andre, can I just ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
So, the second point I was going to make was something which whether we're talking about regulators or the industry, and by the way, it's interesting you talk about pharma, we did not talk about medtech, because I think there's some issues there that we haven't even addressed. Mm-hmm. I think at the end of the day, and you alluded to that in your presentation, the one thing I think at the end of the day which really, really makes a difference is RWE, real world evidence. I mean, how, if the product has been in use and how many thousands or millions of patients, and what is the adverse effect profile? Now, the flip side, of course, of that is that when you are investigating a new drug, you're collecting any kind of, sort of small adverse effect and everything. You cannot release the drug unless you've had, you've collected that amount of data. But at the end of the day, I think real world evidence, and I'm surprised still, be it in Europe, the US are trying to do it now. Certainly in the emerging markets, it's not there yet. How many regulators are not really systematically going, and this is like a regulatory responsibility rather than an industry responsibility. There are 1 or 2 countries, by the way, in Europe, also in Eastern Europe, which are doing that systematically. Mm-hmm. But real world evidence is systematically not yet being collected across the board today.
Is a great point. And I mean, I tease some of my colleagues and I say, well, because they go to me and say, well, real world evidence. And I say, so you're telling me that clinical trials are not real? And they went, no, we're not saying that. We're saying they're selective. And I think you're right. Clinical trials are highly selective. So, if we take any medicine, whether it's an oncology, rheumatology, COVID medicine, we've selected very, very defined populations, and then we go out into the real world with ethnic diversity, lifestyle diversity, ConMed diversity, whatever it is, drugs of abuse diversity. So I think you're right, and I think that's where I pointed to. We're heavily involved in the post-approval setting, whether it's Japan PMS or whether it's post-approval safety studies in Europe. Those are pretty fundamental. Now, I think real-world studies sometimes end up with biases, and epidemiology is also bedeviled with bias. But it is a good way forward. And as I say, that first post-launch period, call it plus 5 years, it's an imperative that we collect data and the best possible data we can, because without that, actually, it's very difficult to determine whether the clinical trial picture is then represented in call it the real world setting.
Any more questions?
I think I should. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add something to it. So, actually, wonderful discussion over here. I would, reiterate the point which you are making right now, that phase 4 clinical trials are of high importance. Not only the clinical trials which are done in the in a very restrictive manner. I think phase 4 trials would be a good provides good value. I remember back a year, 2-3 years back, when we launched Herceptin here in Pakistan. So we did the doctors did the clinical trials here with the patients. They found out very minor kind of, or no severe kind of adverse events, just like the case of COVID vaccine we were discussing about. But in the real world, there may be some changes which are pretty evident with the current vaccines that are available in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think you're right. And I think if you take Japan, Korea, and others, I mean, they're very mindful. They've always been mindful of that. And I think, as you say, from Pakistan or Asia in general, is we've known from the outset that whether it's call it metabolic differences, intrinsic physiological differences, can alter how people respond to drugs, and it's imperative that we understand in those particular communities what the profile is and do that proactively.
Right. Another important thing that which I got from the session was not only the automation or the AI use would increase the data collection for the analysis for the pharma companies, but also for the patients who are reporting it. I remember when patients used to report, we used to collect adverse event profiles or adverse event reactions from patients for different institutes. They were pretty reluctant, since it is generally a very tedious kind of process. People don't want to report. So if we make something which can automate or make the process a bit easier for the patients, for the patients as well, I think that would greatly enhance the impact that we are looking forward to.
Yep, agree.
Yeah, I think that goes back into your point, Andrew, before about multiple ways for the patients to do it. With some people are techie, some aren't, so there's lots of different ways. Yeah, and I guess that's that whole make it easy for everyone, that's customer first in a way. You want that easy way to get the information.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Someone, did you have another one? Oh, Christoph, yes.
Hello, hi. Wonderful conversation here. I appreciate it a lot. And can you confirm? I understand you said ideally lead by example, and we see some manufacturers go ahead and start creating those pharmacovigilance instruments, and others would follow. What would you say? What would you predict? What's going to happen here? What would you wish for in the current COVID situation to happen, so that we can benefit from all these real-world data and understand what we can do in our next round of vaccines that we need to create, so that we can use AI to create a more efficient way of protecting ourselves?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think the COVID situation, I think, it offers us a unique sort of circumstances. Firstly, there are a number of, firstly, we start with the vaccines. There are a number of different classes of vaccines. So I think it's first important to determine what the profiles are across the different types of vaccines. So there's data. So I think there's the question of, independent of the individual pharma companies, the data needs to be made available more publicly to say, okay, if I've got an mRNA or an adenovirus vaccine or whatever, or traditional protein vaccine, what is the profile that we're seeing afterwards? Because at the moment, there's a lot of noise saying, well, there's cerebral vein thrombosis with one class, and is it seen with others? So I think that's the first part. How can we develop comparators that will enable us to almost go, well, where do I titrate my benefit risk across the population? The question then of AI, I think what we've seen is the introduction of AI works well on, I think, almost post-processing the data, and it actually gives you, call it the data cleanup piece. There's often pieces of data that still require, call it manual effort. If AI can enable a better structuring of that data, there's a more universal pool of that data. So I think my plea at the moment is, maybe it's just sort of doing things in a different way, but I don't think that's feasible. I mean, I think one question would be, how do we create a single data pot of COVID data? That seems, despite trying to work on various agencies, whether that's COVAX or others, it's never really taken off. But I think that ultimately is the way to go. So accepting that's not in place, I think the other is making the data more widely available in terms of the post-approval data that's coming through, so that companies are, so regulators or academic investigators can then go, okay, we can really see how many doses were given, the data on the post-approval, then the post-approval reactions have been documented, ideally in a publication with raw data. We can then make assessments and then plan for the future and plan, well, what was the cerebral vein thrombosis rate versus COVID itself? What was the cerebral vein thrombosis versus, mRNA versus nanovirus vaccine? And we can make those assessments. At the moment, we don't necessarily know the denominator. We don't know how many vaccinations, the type of people that have been vaccinated. We don't know how many adverse drug reactions have occurred. I think my plea would be, get the data out there, a bit like clinical trials, publish the data, publish it with denominator data. And, I perhaps the best example I would give you, so we were trying to do some forecasting. So Christoph, we were challenged by our pharma clients is, tell us how many adverse drug reactions you think there will be after the COVID vaccination. And we went, well, we think it's about 1 in 1,000. They said, nah, you guys it's way over the top. So we went, okay, well, back to data. So we went back to 2 data sources, and one was Australian epidemiology data from the TGA and the Australian government, who published data on flu vaccination. And they then, because I worked on the pandemic stuff in terms of flu pandemic, so it was going back in time, so it's sort of semi-familiar. So we looked at, what's the level of flu vaccine adverse event reporting in an average season? Nah, not that high. Then there was the pandemic spike, and it was like, whoa, let's see the curve. So we went, okay, so it was like, I think it was not quite 1 in 1,000, but a bit, it was getting there. So maybe 1 in 2,000, 1 in 3,000. Then we went and we went back to GSK's data, which was, I have to say, it was a stunning publication by the vaccine team, who published the Shingrix data. And they said, we immunized 1 million people over the age of 50 with Shingrix, which is the shingles, herpes zoster vaccination. And it's I would say a slightly more nasty vaccine than some of the others, but the population was an older population. So that was the advantage of looking at that. And they said 9 million, and here's the adverse event data, not many serious reactions, but non-serious was 1 in 1,000. And I thought, so I thought what I had there was somebody who'd had the balls to look at the exposure data. How many doses did we give out? Where were those doses? What was the characteristic of the population? And they published that data in a peer-reviewed journal. So I could go back to that and say, look, here's data. And then the Australian government was, again, publicly available data on their regular flu vaccine and the pandemic vaccine. And it showed a dramatic shift because of social media, public interest, concerns, you name it. And I thought, well, that's probably going to be the same in COVID. So I think that's the lessons for me, is for God's sake, pharma, publish your data, make it available like you do in clinical trials, make it openly available for scrutiny. I have to say, some of the vaccine manufacturers have been better than others in making that data publicly available. They made their protocols available, they published the data, it was easy to replicate the data and say, okay, yep, makes sense. Others were less transparent. So I think transparency, to me, that's the end game here, because that enables all of us to trust the data and be able to reanalyze the data.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that makes sense, Christoph. Yeah, look up. It was Jens et al. Who published the Shingrix data. Jens now heads up safety at GSK, so he was one of the vaccine heads, and then he's now taken over all of drug safety at GSK, and it was a great publication, and credit to him for doing it.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any more questions?
I think not a question, but more a comment. Georgina, were you going to ask something? No. I think, Andrew, I mean, again, listening to this fascinating conversation this afternoon, it just, makes you wonder again that we're living actually increasingly in a world where we just do not want to accept and expect risks.
Yes.
So we want to live in a risk-free environment, be it now COVID or be it not anything else. I mean, and there I think the industry, by the way, has not, and the regulators, I have to take both at the same time, have really not been doing their job in saying, look, the amount of adverse effect that we're talking about is something like 0.001% of the people who've been vaccinated. So, and you cannot live, and this is a political sort of question also, can you actually live in a risk-free environment?
You can't, and I mean, it's a great point. I mean, let's assume, lots of people experience mild reactions following vaccination, and particularly COVID vaccination. That's okay. And let's say a minority of people experience serious reactions. And, I went back through the data, the recently published data on cerebral vein thrombosis. And, obviously there are some cases associated with certain vaccines, call it the Janssen and the AstraZeneca vaccine. But there was a very, the nice publication from the Oxford team was, so if we look at, I think it's 39, the incidence of cerebral vein thrombosis following COVID is 39 per million. And with AstraZeneca's vaccine, it's 5 per million. Okay, so what do you want to do? Do you want to get COVID? Or do you want to be vaccinated? I mean, my view is the risks of the disease, whether immediate or long-term, are so much higher than the risks of vaccination. It's a no-brainer, which is why I've used the phrase benefit-risk throughout, because, I mean, I'm sure, like all of you, it's too easy to focus on the risk. It's actually what are you trying to prevent? And then secondarily, what's the level of risk in that individual, and what's the benefit they're deriving? With COVID vaccination, it's a no-brainer. Similarly, if God forbid I had some form of severe cancer, and let's say the drug that I was being given caused me serious or severe diarrhea for a week, I probably would put up with it if the likelihood of cure was high. Yeah. I probably wouldn't care. So, but I would expect the doctors and the pharma company to communicate with me and say, you know what, Andrew, we've seen, 20% of people experience severe diarrhea in the first 2 weeks of treatment. We know it resolves. Please stick with your treatment. Please tell us about it, because we're trying to tailor the doses. But, don't stop your treatment. So I think my view about it is the over-communication backwards and forwards enables people to make meaningful benefit-risk decisions for themselves. Like you, at the moment in the COVID world, I believe we're going into, let's try and eliminate risk where you can't. We're going to have to move on with life, because actually the number of lives we're probably losing as a result of other diseases is now getting high. So it's not a risk-free world, unfortunately. Anyway.
Yes,
okay, Christoph.
Another remark that regards the risks. My observations to some extent show that the highest risk that anyone can fear is that they cannot go back to normal life. So I think that's why vaccination rates have been going up quite steep, because a lot of organizations started to communicate that you won't be able to go there to do this without a vaccine. Yeah. So I think that is playing for the vaccine and the risk of the vaccine balance to going back to your regular life.
I'm completely with you, Christoph, and I think the regular life, we've got a risk of regular life. Unfortunately, has a risk. And unfortunately, the diseases that we're trying to vaccinate against have a severe risk. So we need to sort of accept that there's going to be some risk of whatever we do. Some of it will just be random. I mean, frankly, there'll be an association but not causation.
Yeah.
So that's the other part. Unfortunately, that's the difficulty. Then you get into the media stuff. Is everything that happens must be causally related, as we all know. It's random association just happens. My view is collect the data, publish the data, make it available in a scientifically digestible way for everybody, so that people can, as you say, we can get back to life as hopefully in a more normal way. But the same applies to other medicines. I think the extreme is oncology, where people are prepared to take much higher risks because they want to get back to normal life, which is I don't want to die of cancer. I want to actually look after my family. So risk is there, but we've got to balance it with what's it mean for you and how can you mitigate that risk, and is it going to be a temporary or a permanent, all that stuff.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you especially to you, Andrew, for enlightening all of us on how this can be improved, and let's hope something happens from this.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Well, good to see you all.
Yes, likewise. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
So,
Thank you.
Bye.
okay, thanks everybody.